Good evening. I'm Tom Campbell, Director of the Metropolitan Museum, and I'd like to welcome our distinguished guests and our audience to the Met this evening for this important discussion. At first glance, an art museum might seem like an unlikely forum for a conversation like this, but in fact, we are an institution devoted to objects deeply connected to history's economic forces. Throughout history, artistic production has been linked to economic prosperity. As societies developed, so too did artistic output and patronage, and our collections are largely reflective of that dynamic. From the ivories of the Neo-Assyrian Empire dating as early as the 9th century BC, to the Egyptian Temple of Denda, created under the wealth of the Roman Empire 800 years later. From the gold threads found in ancient Chinese tapestries to the portraits in our Renaissance portrait exhibition that asserted the strength and humanist ideals of 15th century Italy. Indeed, our galleries chart the rise and fall of civilizations throughout history. The exchange and sale of artistic objects has also been a crucial component in the development of the trade routes around the world, the Silk Road, for example, or the development of critical ports, Antwerp, Venice, and many others, allowing the abundant exchange of ideas and resources. By the beginning of the 1st century AD, merchants, diplomats, and travelers could, with some difficulty, cross the ancient world from the Mediterranean to China and Japan in the east. Such trade routes were the communication highways of the ancient world, allowing for the flow of religious beliefs, languages, social customs, and artistic styles. You just have to visit our Asian galleries, for example, to see how the sculpture of Gandhara, modern-day Pakistan and northern India, was influenced by the Hellenistic styles popularized by the Romans. If we briefly visit the conditions of this museum's founding and evolution, you will also find an inextricable link to the economic circumstances of post-Civil War New York. It was the idea of private citizens to create this public art museum, and it was the fortunes built from railroads and industry that allowed it to happen. There would have been no Egyptian excavations without the likes of J.P. Morgan, and certainly much thinner collections here without the likes of Jacob Rogers, a businessman who made locomotives in Paterson, New Jersey, and who in 1902 unexpectedly left the Metropolitan $5 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in today's art-buying terms. When the Met was founded in 1870, it did not own a single work of art, and its growth during the late 19th and 20th century is a reflection of America and New York's economic prosperity across that period. Today, the Met is the largest truly encyclopedic museum in the world, with an annual gross operating budget of $300 million. We have the highest attendance of any museum in the United States, just under 5.8 million people last year, with an audience that is 40% international and an additional 50 million visitors on our website. We have the largest acquisition program of any Western museum, spending $40 to $50 million annually, with many times that coming in the form of gifts. And we maintain the largest exhibition program in the world, with about 30 exhibitions a year, and the largest publication program of any museum. In this year alone, we will produce 22 scholarly art history books. All this funded not by the government, but by private philanthropy, benefiting from a long-standing American philanthropic tradition and critical tax incentives introduced in 1917. Today, nearly 90% of our annual operating budget is privately funded. In the past 17 years, over $1 billion has been raised from private sources to support our capital projects and endowment. So, as I look to the future, we have quite a vested interest in the continuing prosperity of the American economy, and I hope I'm going to hear good news from our panelists. Let me end by suggesting that the Met is uniquely positioned to engage in this sort of global dialogue, outlined for tonight's program. A large part of what the Met offers our national and international audience is that it is a lens to envision the future within the context of history. I see tonight's program as very much integrated with that part of our mission, and I'm delighted to welcome the editor of the New York Review of Books, Robert Silver, to our stage to moderate this critical discussion. So with no further ado, gentlemen, it's over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thanks also to the members of the Met staff. Been so helpful in arranging this evening. We couldn't imagine a more congenial place for this forum than the Metropolitan Museum. It's a symposium on world economic problems. It's brought to you not only by the New York Review of Books and the Met, but also by our friends at the very generous Fritt Ord Foundation in Oslo, which has often collaborated with the Review in supporting meetings such as this one. And I want to thank George Soros for donating copies of his just published book, which you will have seen on the tables outside. And finally, I want to thank Simon Head of Oxford, who's been the major organizer of this evening. And I should remind you that books by other panelists will be available following tonight's event. Now, for this evening, we raised several issues with our participants. We thought of the continuing problems of the euro and the tightrope being walked in Greece as we speak, and the question of how the euro itself will fare as a common currency without a European treasury or a stronger constitution. We thought, secondly, of the shaky situation of the United States since the recession and how its problems of high unemployment and stagnant income will be affected by our political situation here, as well as the crisis in the Eurozone. Third, we raised the question of the Chinese economy, which has functioned as an engine of global economic growth in recent years. How will it respond if its chief export markets in Europe and the US remain weak? Finally, hovering over all these issues is the question of global warming and how measures to deal with it could possibly be integrated with the other economic concerns I've mentioned. Now, to deal with these questions, we have here, I think, a remarkable panel of economic experts and commentators. In alphabetical order, we have Paul Krugman, whose work we all read in the New York Times. He's been a skeptical commentator both about the direction of European austerity and American fiscal policy. He's won the Nobel Prize. He's currently a professor at Princeton. His most recent book is The Return of Depression Economics and the Crisis of 2008. Now here we have next to me Edmund Phelps. He's professor at Columbia, won the Nobel Prize also in 2006 for his work on the relation between short-run and long-run effects on economic policy. He's the author of the book Rewarding Work, How to Restore Participation and Self-Support to Free Enterprise. Jeffrey Sachs, on my left, is the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia, which deals